Good day, SE2BE and SE2AE. I am Paolo Angelo Albay, and with my co-presenters, we are here to present to you the functional approaches in the topic of first language acquisition, and we are the group 4. Now, before we start, let me introduce you to the learning outcomes. Now, first, one of our learning outcomes is that to know and understand the theory of functionalist approach. And the second is to understand cognition and language development. The third one is to observe the use of graphic organizer in the functional approaches. Without further ado, let's start this. Hello and welcome back to school. And let me present to you about the functional approach. So the functional approach is considered to be the second paradigm of psychology. When we say paradigm, this is something that is model or something that psychologists or learners of psychology were looking up to. And to be frank, also linguistics, also people who study language also look at this model, which is the functional approach. Now, this idea focuses on the function of the mental processes, which involves what? Consciousness. This is according to Gordon in 1995. And while we are going to focus on the mental processes and consciousness, no, I just would like to share that even though Gordon has something to say about this, the functional approach, the one who really developed this idea, the functional approach, is William James in 1980. So he is the one who had a more time and more focus on the functional approach, and which is why we're going to tackle it this day. So first and foremost, let's have a clarity. Why are we going to study about functional approaches or functionalist approaches? You should know the main goal first. So what is the main goal of functionalist approaches? To clarify the dynamic relationship between form and function. You may be asking a question, what is form and function? So it has been discussed before, but we will have a recap later by my co-presenters. So this main goal or definition was provided by Thompson in 2003. Now, knowing the goal is to give clarity, of the dynamic relationship between form and function, I would like to say that the functional approaches, which are characterized as functional, differ from emphasis and definition. So when we say emphasis, this is something that we put our target on or focus on. So it's something that highlights. And definition is the meaning, of the functional approaches. So we're going to dissect that all the more. Now, knowing that it differs in emphasis and definition, it also shares the following characteristics in general opposition to those in the Chomskyan tradition. So what is Chomskyan tradition? Let me introduce to you these three Chomskyan tradition. The first is one, focus is on the use of language in real situation, or what we call performance. Or when you go outside, you interact with people, that is the focus, no, on the use of language. Number one, performance. Just remember the word performance. And as well as underlying knowledge, which is competence. So those are the two parts of the first Chomskyan tradition, performance and competence. Let's move on to the second one. The Chomskyan tradition, no sharp distinction is made between the two. It's one of the things that we're going to assess because just like I said earlier, it's about the dynamic difference between form and function. But let me tell you this, there is no sharp distinction. That's why no study of SLA, which means second language acquisition, with the assumption that the purpose of language is communication, and the development of linguistic knowledge in our first language, L1, and our second language, L2, requires communicative use. So let us have a common ground here that in our functional approach, everything here is used to communicate. Okay, as simple as that. And let's move on to our number three, the last part of the Chomskyan tradition. The Chomsky tradition scope of concern goes beyond the sentence to include discourse. Now, what again is discourse? Conversation. Discourse structure and how language is used in interaction, and to include aspects of communication beyond language according to Tomlin in 1990. So, as we can see here, the functional approach is really focused on how we use the language to communicate. As simple as that. And now, here is Bea to present to give you more clarity about the functional approaches in language acquisition. Take it away, Bea.
Functionalists believe that the communicative situation motivates, constrains, or otherwise determines grammatical structure, meaning that the language choices a child makes during the development are heavily influenced by the functional purpose they serve. A functional approach to language development focuses on functional linguistic theories to provide strategic or getting students involved in debates about language in the classroom as they explore the meaning of texts. These methods offers a meta-language for discussing the meanings behind the decision of the author. Functionalism is an approach to language development that focuses on the relationship between language, form, and social meaning. It's according to Emmett et al. 2015. That is, language is not so much a system of rules as posed by Chomsky, but a means of performing particular socially communicative functions. The functionalist theory is based on the work of Michael Halliday, who observed the ways his infant son Nigel attempted to communicate. He noticed that Nigel would use specific recognizable vocalizations to accomplish particular functions long before anything resembling words or sentences were used. From this, he concluded that the language choice of a child are heavily influenced by the functional purpose they serve. A child will use specific and recognizable vocalization to accomplish particular functions before anything resembling words or sentences were used. And lastly, language is a matter of learning the kind of meanings that can be shared in a particular situations, and the children learn grammar based on meaningful choices rather than rules. Another element of Halliday's functionalist theory are the seven functions of language, which were designed to reflect the various conversational interactions that children develop during language acquisitions. Here are the following. First, we have the instrumental, which is a language for getting things done or for satisfying one's needs. Next, we have the regulatory one, which is a language for controlling the behavior of others. Next one, we have the interactional, which is a language for maintaining and establishing relationships. And we also have the personal, which refers to language for expressing personally and individually. We also have the heuristic, which means a language for finding things out or for exploring the environment. Next, we have the imaginative, which is a language as a means of creating a world of one's own. And lastly, the representational, which is a language for conveying information. They believe that when children realize the potential that these functions serve, they will become more skillful in using them when communicating and expressing meanings to others.
Good morning, future educators, and now let's move on to cognition and language development. Okay, but before we start our main discussion, try to ask yourself, how do you learn a language? Okay, thank you. I hope you understand and it's been clear for you on how you learn a language. And now let's proceed to the main discussion. I would like to introduce to you Louise Muscat Blue. She is an American developmental psychologist and a professor and an author pioneering research elucidated the roles of cognition, emotion, and social behavior in a language acquisition. Her research makes a clear explanation on how cognition emotion, and social behavior affects language acquisition and development. Louise Bloom (1971) cogently illustrated the first issue in her criticism of a pivot grammar when she pointed out that the relationships in which words occur and telegraphic utterances are only superficially similar. For example, in the utterance "Mommy suck," which nativists will describe as a sentence consisting of a pivot word and an open word. When we say a pivot grammar, this is a two words utterances in which one word, but typically a function word. Especially these words are commonly used by the toddler or little ones. Telegraphic utterances are important to them because with the use of telegraphic utterances, it means they learn and they try to communicate their feelings and thoughts. Bloom found at least possible underlying relations. So we have the agent action, mommy is putting the sock on, or agent object, mommy sees the sock, and possessor possess, or mommy sucks. There is a meaning for them. Nativists believe that children have an innate ability to learn a language. Behaviorists believe development of words is a result of a certain behavior such as imitation. But in cognition, there's a meaning for them. They are trying to communicate to express their thought and feelings in a simple utterances, like a pivot grammar or a telegraphic utterances. Bloom's research paved the way for a new wave of child language study, this time centering on the relationship of cognitive development to L1 acquisition. Learning and developing a language is just not only by imitating or an innate ability, but cognitive development is also play an important role in language acquisition and development. Like John Piaget and Barbara Inhelder (1969) describes overall development as the result of children's interaction with their environment. According to Piaget, what children learn about language is determined by what they already know about the world. In a short meaning, because children are growing and nurturing by the world. Gutman and Wayne (1982) children appear to approach language learning equipped with a conceptual interpretive abilities for categorizing the world. Communicating simple, they can have an idea on how to conceptualize and categorize the word. Dan Slovin (1997), among others, demonstrated that in all languages, semantic learning depends on cognitive development and that sequences of development are determined more by semantic complexity than by structural complexity. Learning or development of a language starts in a simple as long as it's developed and it becomes complex by not just imitating but in learning. Bloom (1996) likewise noted that what children know will determine what they learn about the code for both speaking and understanding message. So child language researchers began to tackle the child's acquisition of the functions of language and the relationship of the forms of language to those functions. Okay, so but we need also to be careful on what we say, especially parents, because they can adapt or acquire anything about we spoken out, avoiding using mouthing words when they are a child. Acquiring language is always a psychological task for the child, not a logical one, and the linguistic problems to be solved are always embedded in personal and interpersonal contexts. Because we believe that acquiring knowledge can be innate or innate ability and also part of our cognitive development. Developments in affect, cognition, and social interaction provide the driving force for acquiring a language. Affect promotes engagement with the physical and personal world for learning and for sustaining intersubjectivity with other persons. Social interaction also has a big contribution in learning and development. development of a language. Cognitive development yields conceptual knowledge and the symbolic capacity for the mental representation that language expresses and that result from interpreting the expressions of the others. Okay, so cognitive development also represents that everyone or every child has a symbolic capacity, not just only iconic or inactive representation. In a classroom setup, cognitive development plays an important role in acquisition and development of language, where we simply learn a simple utterances or the telegraphic utterances. In school, teachers teach us a proper way of speaking of the language. It becomes simple to complex.
Thank you so much, Mark. Now let's move on to social interaction and language development. Language development is interconnected with social and functional acquisition, not just in cognition and memory. Many investigations of child language are centered in interactive and or communicative functions of language. So it is observed between the interaction of a child's acquisition and the learning on how social systems operate in human behavior. So take note, human behavior. Um, it is said that you know interaction or the communication or social conversation with other people can mean that a child can learn language by it or through it by discourse or interaction. Now, speaking of discourse, what is discourse? Discourse, according to Merriam-Webster dictionary, is a formal, orderly, and usually extended expression of thought on a subject. So, discourse is the interchange of or exchange of thoughts, ideas that gives us the explanation that a child can learn language through interaction, like what I have said earlier. So within this perspective, the very vital part of language is being tackled in all its variability that falls on communicative and pragmatic function. So when we say pragmatic, it is realistic, it is sensible, it is practical. In terms of linguistics, no, pragmatic is the meaning, the literal meaning of a word. So when you analyze it deeply, the cognition and memory, how we process the words into our minds, the thoughts that we create before we um, before we say anything, the human behavior and how do we respond to things, the response that we do, the reaction that we release when we are communicating with other people. Excuse me. And the rules given to have a structured sentences and grammar, because without rules um, we cannot create or gather our information orderly. Specifically, we cannot understand or comprehend without any rules or structure, no. That is why all of them, cognition, behavior, and rules, are all observable in social interaction. So that is discourse. Now, one of the theories that are relevant and somehow worked in social interaction and language development is from B.F. Skinner's verbal behavior, wherein it focuses on the idea that a meaning of a word is found in their functions. No? For us to teach a child with language delays a meaning of a word, one must first teach its function. We need to somehow first understand the purpose, the idea, the function of the word before we identify or before we determine or define a certain word. So that is why whenever we witnessed or we see spelling bees or contest related to that, no, the contestant asks the panelist to use the given word in a sentence. So For example, the word abyss. If you don't know the word abyss, you do not define them by just looking in the word, in the structure of the word. No, we determine or we define the word based on the function that is given in a sentence. So, for example, a rope led down into the dark abyss. So, the clue here is led down into the dark abyss. It could be mean that it is a bottomless pit. It is completely empty. It is a void. It is, you know, talks about emptiness, straight to nothingness. No, no. With that, knowing the function of the word and how to use it will definitely help us to decipher, to decode, and to understand the message and the structure of the message that is given by others when we are communicating or interacting with them. Okay. Again, in verbal behavior, it is an observable action and it is also learned behavior that can be acquired, developed, and sustained through the application of behavioral strategies such as prompting, reinforcing, plant ignoring, etc. So this means that there are consequences. Now we when we are having interaction or conversation with other people, there are consequences that may happen. And within that, operant or utterances are present, such as hesitations, pauses, backtracking, and the like, that is significant, indeedly significant, or very significant conversational cues in social interaction. The linguist can no longer deal with abstract, formal rules, complexity, without dealing with all the minutiae, the trivial or the little things of day-to-day performance that were previously set aside in a search for systematicity. So language is not complex as we think, no, as we think it should be. Language is very simple in terms of social interaction, of course, but it is in a sense that communication or interaction can mean that we understand, we comprehend a certain language or a language based on the structure, the use, the delivery of the message for us to understand them. Okay, so next we have Flory May. Flory, the stage is yours.
Thank you, Jean. And now let's move on to our graphic organizer and we discuss the behaviorist, mediation theory, nativist, functional. Into our behaviorists, we have tabula rasa, stimuli linguistic response, conditioning, and reinforcement. Into our mediation theory, we have mediating response, and to our nativist, innate predisposition or LAD, and UG, and systematic rule government acquisition, creative construction, pivot grammar, parallel distributed processing. And for our functional, we have constructivist, social interaction, cognition and language, functions of language, and discourse. And now let's move on to behaviorist tabula rasa. So the tabula rasa under of the behaviorist, tabula rasa has a Latin word. Tabula means scrap tablet and rasa is clean slate. In epistemology, theory of knowledge and psychology, a supposed condition that empiricists have attributed to the human mind before ideas have been imprinted on it by the reaction of these senses, the external world of objects. So, John Locke is a philosopher. An empirical theory of knowledge had a major impact on the thinkers who followed. And by idea, Locke means howsoever is the object of the understanding. when a person thinks. In other words, an idea is anything you experience or reflected on. And a new of revolutionary emphasis on the tabula rasa occurred late in the 17th century when the English empiricist and John Locke is an essay concerning human understanding in 1689 argued for the mind's initial resemblance to white paper, void of all characters with all the materials of reasons and knowledge derived from experience. Locke himself acknowledged an innate power of reflection, means awareness of one's own ideas, sensation, emotion, and so on, as mean exploiting the materials given by experience as well as a limited realm of a prior is non-experimental knowledge, which is nevertheless regarded as trifling and is essentially empty of content. Its soul is soul, and every man is an animal. And next is the stimulus linguistic response. Stimulus response theory is a concept in the psychology that refers to the belief that behavior manifests as a result of the interplay between stimulus and response. Extension of the linguistic stimulus response formula proposed by Bloomfield, a famous behaviorist and structuralist in linguistics. Through the study of the similar response, process, and communication under certain circumstances and indicates of the original linguistics, similar response formula are pointed out. So, Bloomfield language was once regarded as the model of the scientific methodology and the greatest work in linguistics on both sides of the Atlantic Ocean in the 20th century. In the Book of Language, he used an interesting example to illustrate the stimulus response phenomenon in verbal communication. Suppose that Jack and Jill are walking down a lane. Skills is hungry. She sees an apple in a tree. She makes a noise with her larynx, tongue, and lips. Accordingly, he proposed the linguistic stimulus response formula. So we have here the Bloomfield's view and study of meaning in linguistics. So Bloomfield language was once regarded as the model of the scientific methodology and the greatest work in linguistics on both sides of the Atlantic Ocean in the 20th century. In the Book of Language, he used an interesting example to illustrate the similar response phenomenon in verbal communication. Suppose that Jack and Jill are walking down on a lane and Jill is hungry. She sees an apple in a tree. She makes a noise with her larynx, tongue, and lips. Accordingly, he proposed the linguistic stimulus response formula. So we have here the linguistic response formula. So here are the S stands for the practical stimulus to one of the participants and the R as the substitute reaction of one of the participant. And S is the substitute stimulus to the other participant. And R is the external practical reaction of the other one. In addition, Bloomfield linguistic stimulus response theory is greatly influenced by behaviorism. Behaviorism assumes that all things organisms, including acting, thinking, and feeling, and any physical action can should be and regarded as a behavior. And next is the conditioning. It is a theory that our reaction, response to an object or event stimulus by a person or animal can be modified by learning or conditioning. So the most famous here is the Pavlov's discovery of conditioning. The most famous experiment by the psychologist related to conditioning referred to as Pavlov's dog. The experiment door with feeding time by selecting a bell as the unconditioned stimulus instead of the person arriving to the feed the dog as his previous test. Pavlov was providing a stimulus to which feeding was related. For the example, a dog receiving positive attention after fetching a stick back to its owner, learns to associate bringing the object back with favorable attention and positive reinforcement. So, Pavlov's discovery of conditioning, this mode of learning was demonstrated by the experiment of Ivan Pavlov, who decided to research conditioning after discovering during separate gastric tests that his dog subjects began to salivate not only when meat powder were present to them, but more significantly when the person feeding them came into proximity with them. The dog had been inadvertently trained through classical conditioning to associate the person feeding them with the food and itself reacting in similar way. It's called salivation to the feeders. This is known as a stimulus response SR when salivation becomes a response action to the stimulus of the person feeding the dogs. At the start of experiments, the unconditioned neutral stimulus US or NS is the person arriving to feed the dogs before the salivation as a result of their presence had begun. The unconditioned response UR was for the dogs not to salivate. By the end of the experiment, when the unconditioned stimulus and response had been conditioned. So, the conditioned stimulus CS become a salivation, normally a reflex action to aid digestion when feeding is going discovering this associative learning on the part of the dogs, and Pavlov decided to carry out further research specific to conditioning. So next is the reinforcement. It is the process of encouraging or establishing a belief or pattern of behavior, especially by encouragement or reward. It is the positive feedback leads to reinforcement, and it is a consequence applied that will strengthen or organism future behavior. Whenever the behavior is preceded by a specific antecedent stimulus, and for the example, reinforcement might involve presenting praise as a reinforcer. Immediately after a child puts away their toys, the response by reinforces the desired behavior with praise, and the child will be more likely to perform the same action again in the future. Further reinforcements in the Skinner's theory in operant conditioning and positive reinforcement as a response our behavior is strengthened by the rewards, leading the repetition of desired behavior. The reward is reinforcing. And so we have a primary reinforcement. Primary reinforcement is sometimes referred to as unconditional reinforcement. Occurs naturally. Primary reinforce often have an evolutionary basis in that they aid in the survival of the species. As such, they don't require learning in order to work. And we have example of primary reinforcers include air, food, sleep, water, sex. Genetics may also play a role in primary reinforcement. And for example, research suggests that people may pick their mates in part and due to the specific genetic traits that deem to be more preferable. And we have a secondary reinforcement. Secondary reinforcement is involves stimuli that have become rewarding by being paired with another reinforcing stimulus by being paired with another. This is also known as conditioned reinforcement. And for example, when training a dog, praise and treats might be used as primary reinforce. The sound of the clicker can be added with the praise and treats as a secondary reinforcers. Eventually, the sound of the clicker alone begins to work as a reinforce. And also we have a positive and negative reinforcement. In operant conditioning, there are two different types of reinforcement beyond primary and secondary. Both of influence behavior but in two different ways. So the positive reinforcement, this involves adding or something to increase response, such as a giving piece of candy to a child after they clean the room. And the negative reinforcement, this involves removing or something to increase response, such as a canceling a quiz if students turn it off their homework for the week. By removing the aversive stimulus or the quiz, the teacher hopes to increase the desired behavior, completing all homework. While these terms involve the words positive and negative, it's important to note that Skinner did not utilize this to mean good or bad. So instead, thinking of what the terms would mean when used mathematically. So the benefits are I so the importance of it, reinforcement, it can use the teach new skills, teach of replacement behavior for an inferring behavior, increase appropriate behaviors, or increase on task behavior. Reinforcement may seem like simple strategy that all teachers use but in often not used as effectively could be. And now we're here, the mediation theory. And mediation theory is the hypothesis that stimuli affect behavior indirectly through an intervening process as opposed of simpler stimulus or response model. And we have here a mediating response. And it's a response that elicited by a stimulus and it's subsequently responsible for imitation of behavior. And according to Fodor, the motion of an implicit mediating response is an element in much contemporary psychological theory belonging to the SNR, or the use of term that may be preferable, neo-associationist current. Fodor begins by pointing out the inadequacies of single-state models, as there is no quarrel with the conclusions that he draws here. So, he does not object to speaking of verbalizations loosely as responses, but he denies that there is an evidence that they are response in the strict serve or of facts correlated with stimuli. So, the nativist is the order of innate predisposition. Language is what we use to communicate with each other on a daily basis. Given this is a natural that language is a part of our culture and evolves as a cultures do. And nativist study of a child language acquisition were free to construct hypothetical grammar, that is descriptions of linguistic system of a child language, although such grammar will still solidity based on empirical data. So these grammars were largely formal representations of the deep structure that abstract rules underlying surface output. The structures not overtly manifest in speech. According to Noam Chomsky, is perhaps the best known and the most influential linguistic of the second half of the 20th century. He made a number of strong claims about language. In particular, he suggests the language is an innate faculty. That is to say that we are born with set of rules about language in our needs and refers to us in the UG. So, next is the systematic rule governed acquisition. Is subsequent years is the generative rule governed model in the Chomskyan tradition was challenged. The assumptions underlying this tradition is those generative rule or items in algebraic sense are connected similarly with other connections between each pair of neurons in the brain. And next is the pivot grammar. And nativist studies of a child language acquisition were free to construct hypothetical grammars, that is description of linguistic systems of child language. Although such grammars will still solidity based on empirical data, these grammars were largely formal representation of the deep structure, the abstract rules underlying surface output the structures not overtly manifest in speech. Linguists began to examine child language from early one and two word forms of telegraphy. Those complex language of five to 10 years old, borrowing one tenant structural and behavioristics paradigms. They approach the data with few preconceived notions about what child's language ought to be, and probe the data for internally consistent system in much the same way in linguistics described in the language of the field that used generative framework was of course the partial of structural methodology. And the first class, um, since the could pivot around number of words in the second open class. Thus, the first rule of the generative grammar of the child was described as followed. Sentence, pivot word plus open word. And the research data gathered in the generative framework yielded a multitude of such rules. Some of these rules appear to grounded in UG of the child as the child language matures and finally becomes adult-like. The number and complexity of generative rules accounting for language and competence of course boggles the mind. And next is the parallel distributed processing. It's called PDP model. And it's also called connectionism, in which neurons in the brain are said to form multiple connections. Each of 100 billion nerve cells in the brain may be linked as 10,000 of its counterparts. Thus, a child is adult linguistic performance may be the consequence of many levels of simultaneous neural interconnections rather than a serial process of one rule being applied, then other, and so forth. And now we are all here in the last part of our graphic organizer is the functional and the constructivist. It is the case of many of current popular paradigms. You are probably already using the constructivist approach to some degree. Constructivists teacher pose questions and problems, then guide students to help them find their own answer. They use many techniques in the teaching process. For example, they may prompt students to formulate their own question. It's inquiry. Allow multiple interpretations and expressions of learning, multiple intelligences. Encourage group work and the use of peers as resources. Collaborative learning. More information on the above processes is covered in other workshops in this series. For now, it's important to realize that constructivist approach borrows from any other practices in the pursuit of its primary goal and to helping students learn how to learn in a constructivist classroom is learning is. So next we have a social interaction. Social interaction is arise from patterns of communicative signs whose perception and interpretation require a multitude of cognitive functions. The semiotic framework of Peirce's universal categories (UCS) laid ground for a novel cognitive semiotic typology of social interactions. During functional magnetic resonance imaging (fMRI), 16 volunteers watched a movie narrative encompassing verbal and nonverbal social interaction. We have three types of nonverbal interaction. We are coded unresolved, non-habitual, and habitual. Based on typological reflecting Peirce UCS, as expected, the auditory cortex responded to verbal interaction but not verbal interaction. And next, the cognition and language. Interaction between language and cognition remain an unsolved scientific problem. What are the difference in neural mechanism of language and cognition? And why do children acquire language by the age of 6 while taking a lifetime to acquire cognition? What is the role of language and cognition in thinking? So, since the 19th century, we know about involvement of Broca's and weakness around in language. What new knowledge about the brain regions responsible for the language and cognition has been found with fMRI and other brain imaging methods? So every year we know more about their anatomical and functional effective connectivity. So what can be inferred about their interaction function, and language cognition. And such issues regarding brain functions and mind have been increasingly drawing attention from various fields in recent years, and beyond the boundaries of the previous fields of study are become necessary. The need of studies spanning the brain and the mind has given birth to a discipline such as cognitive neuroscience. So next is the functions of language. The function of language is include communication, the expression of identity, play, imaginative expression, and emotional release. And the characteristics of language definition of language. Many definitions of language have been proposed. And Henry Sweet, an English phonetician and language scholar, stated, according to him, language is the expression of ideas by means speech sounds combined into words. Words are combined in sentences. These combinations answering to the ideas into thoughts. So the American linguists Bernard Bloch and George Altrader formulated the following definition. So according to them, a language is a system of arbitrary vocal symbols by means of which social group cooperates. And lastly is the discourse. And discourse is a field of research that is occupying the attention of an increased number of child language researchers, especially is the era of social constructivist research. In this area of conversational or discourse analysis, while parental input is a significant part of the child's development of conversational rules, it is the only one aspect as the child also interacts with peers and, of course, with the other adults. While it used to be generally held the mere exposure to language is sufficient to set child language generating machinery in motion, and clear that in order to successful first language acquisition to take place interaction rather than exposure is required. And this is the end of our discussion. Hopefully you learned something and understand about our topic for today. So thank you.